We're back on the road to Reykjavik with Bobby Fischer. This is the run-up to his extraordinary match with Boris Spassky in Reykjavik 1972. And we left the story with Fischer having just defeated Mark Taimanov by 6-0, a complete trouncing. Well, Fischer's opponent in the semi-final of the candidates was Bent Larsen from Denmark, and this was a very different proposition. So you could say that Fischer and Larsen were the best in the West at that time. So what chances did Larsen have? Well, everyone considered that Larsen would have actually much better chances than Taimanov. If we look at Larsen's tournament record between, let's say, 1967 and 1970, he was phenomenally successful. He had a string of first places, and not just in minor tournaments, big tournaments where he defeated strongest Soviet players actually, and that led him to claim board one in the famous Soviet Union versus rest of the world match in Belgrade in 1970. And Fischer agreed, and Fischer only played on board two with Larsen on board one. Larsen faced Spassky. If you remember, Larsen lost this terrible game to Spassky with the rook's pawn coming down the board. You can find that video on the channel if you want to take a look at that. But actually, remember that Larsen hit back against Spassky, won a game and drew another. They drew their match 1.5 all, and then in the fourth game, Larsen defeated Leonid Stein, a great Soviet player. So Larsen was a class act, and he certainly wasn't afraid of the Soviet players. And indeed, against Fischer, in the interzonal tournament that Fischer had won convincingly, in their individual game, Larsen had defeated Fischer. So how did Larsen get to this semi-final? Well, he had defeated Ullmann, in German player Wolfgang Ullmann in the quarterfinal, pretty convincingly. So his prospects against Fischer, well, an open contest, let's say, even in spite of Fischer being on incredible form, Larsen certainly had his chances. Larsen, of course, much younger than Taimanov. Larsen 36 years old when this match was played, Fischer 28 years old. One thing I find extraordinary is that this match took place in July 1971. The first game was the 6th of July. Fischer and Larsen only finished their quarter-final matches just a month previously at the start of June. So they had, well, roughly 5 weeks to prepare for this match. Not long at all. I mean, not long to sort of come to terms mentally and physically with the quarterfinals. And then it was straight in. Well, this first game, of course, would be crucial with Fischer on this roll of 6 wins against Taimanov. So if Larsen could hold him, at least in this first game, then psychologically that would be very important. And interesting to see Larsen here with black playing a French defence. Now Larsen was not afraid to dabble with all kinds of systems, sometimes very dubious systems. He liked to play the man, not the board. Larsen was an extraordinary optimist at the chessboard, brimming with self-confidence. So he went in for the winnower variation, which he knew that Fischer had sometimes struggled with as white. So very interesting psychological decision from Larsen to play into this. Now, if you've followed the video series on Fischer on this channel, then you'll know that Fischer had sometimes experimented with this variation, which is incredibly risky. And in fact, his results were mixed. But he did lose a game, for example, against Kovacevic in Yugoslavia in 1970 with this line. It's very messy, and it doesn't surprise me that he went back to the main line of the winnower in this game. As Fischer memorably said in his book, My 60 Memorable Games, he said the winnower is anti-positional and weakens the king side. So why did he say that? Well, it's the fact that black has given away this dark-squared bishop, and so this dark-squared bishop of white's is unopposed, and if it can get into black's position on one of these diagonals, it can be very painful for black, as we'll see in this game. And of course white can go in for this mad stuff with queen g4 and taking on g7, which is meant to be the big test for black. But Fischer likes to play more positionally, and so he had faith with a4, much more positional move, preparing under some circumstances to bring the bishop out to a3 on this very nice diagonal. And now here Larsen goes for bishop d7. Korchnoi has shown, or in the 1970s actually, that queen a5 is perhaps the most testing move for white, and currently black is doing reasonably well with that move. But anyway, bishop d7, and here white can choose various things. Bishop e2. I mean, the question is what to do about this bishop. Should it come here, here, or here? Well, Fischer went for bishop d3. Obviously, the best diagonal for the bishop, looking at the king side, but it does tempt black into pushing it away with c4. And I think once the bishop comes here, black is obliged to play this actually to push the bishop off its best diagonal. So white has lost some time, but in so doing, at least these pawns have more security as there's no longer pressure here. It's clearer what white is up against once the pawn structure is fixed. But black can strike back with f6. This is very important. If black doesn't play f6, then this bishop will come out here, and this is very nasty for black. Now, the players have followed exactly a game that Fischer played previously in the United States Championship in 1960-61 against Edmar Mednis. So Fischer-Mednis from this point went bishop a3, which looks very logical, but in fact matters weren't quite so clear after this. It wasn't really possible to plant that bishop on d6. It could be kicked away with a knight f5 sometimes. Now this was simply a very unclear position, but Fischer ended up overpressing and lost this game, so I'm sure this is what Larsen had in mind when he went in for this whole line. But Fischer came up with an improvement in this position, not bishop a3. He played rook e1. Now this is a really canny move. Of course the rook is useful on the e-file, looking at the king, also supporting the e-pawn and ready perhaps just to drop the bishop back. But it's more than that. It's actually a kind of waiting move, actually. White is waiting to see where black commits the king before committing his own pieces. So, for example, if the king goes this side of the board, then in fact this dark squared bishop can end up on h6 rather than a3, and this is already very dangerous with the idea bishop h5. It looks rather comical with white's pieces at the edge of the board, but actually they do a really good job there of putting pressure on the king side and make way for the queen to enter the game, and possibly the rook as well. That queen's a long way from the action. So what about castling queenside? Well, in this case the bishop would probably go to a3 and look down here, and I like the move a5 as well, just pressing on the king side, preventing pawn to b6. And white has a ready-made attack there. And if pawn takes pawn on e5, well, of course, black can't take that pawn because there's a discovered attack. Bishop h5, check. and then rook takes queen. So, well, in a sense, Larsen also played a waiting move with knight g6, so he hasn't committed the king yet, but he's putting more pressure on the e5 pawn. If white took now, then the king would go in that direction, and there's a possibility later to push forward in the middle, so that's really not the way to play for white. But here Fischer played a great move again, bishop a3, looking to sink the bishop on d6, also obviously preventing kingside castling. And because of the threat to put the bishop on d6, then black has to take that pawn in the middle of the board, and of course that opens up the rook, and with the king in the middle as well, then suddenly the position explodes. And wow, what a complex position that the players have reached so early in the game. That pawn really has to be taken. Now queen takes will allow bishop g4, and this is very nasty. Even though the king can escape over here. White just has a tremendous position. Just compare the position of the two kings. Black's is exposed, white's is safe. Great position for white. So knight takes. You could say, yeah, that's in a sense forced. Well, here white has a couple of promising continuations. Bishop h5 check is interesting. Fischer went with queen d4, which is also well, it's a really testing move for black. It's a great move. Black just has a big problem here. What's he going to do with the king? So if it goes to the queen side, you can take on a7. Although there's nothing immediate, the queen will just drop back, and well, white just has a ready-made attack here. I think this is absolutely dreadful. You can just imagine these moves happening, and black is just going to be too slow with any counterplay. What else have we got? Knight c6. Well, first of all, we'll throw in a check, displace the king, and queen g7 must be winning. H5 is interesting, stopping bishop h5 check, but queen h4 is a very strong move, preventing castling and threatening a checkmate as well. And this, so it's too much for black. So Larsen played knight g6, and then bishop h5. So once again, castling queenside will be met by queen a7. So this king is caught in a crossfire. King f7 played by Larsen, and here this is such an interesting moment in the game, and I here in some ways Fischer's move I find really surprising, I have to say, but it's perhaps an indication of his mood. He's really straining every sinew to win this game, to absolutely take the fight to black. He played the pawn to f4, which the idea is to simply blow up black's central position and get through to the king. And it's a really dynamic and ambitious way to play. The downside is that it weakens white's king as well. I say this so often. If you advance the f-pawn, then that is inherently risky when you're castled there. There was another very promising way to play, actually, and that's to put the rook on e3. Potentially bringing rook number 2 over, but also looking to check here and maybe playing here as well. In any case, f4 played. And the idea is, well, for example, if bishop here, well, let's push on, and rook e7 check wins the queen. So therefore rook e8, but Fischer goes forward anyway, and so this just tears down this central pawn formation just opens up the diagonals, opens up the central files just to get through to the king. And some tactics here. For example, bishop e6, this simply doesn't work. We take check again, and rook f1, and the king just gets cut to bits, and this loses. So after queen here, the king has to stagger up the board. Now, in fact, there's no quick kill here. Here, Fischer played bishop f3, which was actually praised almost universally. I should say that this game was analysed by many different players. Timman, for example, Jan Timman wrote in a book called The Art of Chess Analysis, really detailed annotations. And after him, John Spielman, English Grandmaster, also analysed this game in enormous detail. But no one at the time, or even later, mentioned this move. And this is actually the most powerful move in the position. And well, we'll see the idea in a second, but let me just show you one particular variation. After this, then bishop f3 is very powerful. And then bishop takes. And this is simply very good for white, actually. You can see white is in complete control here. And the difference is this, that in this position, there are many other variations, but okay. Bishop f3. And here Larsen played knight e5, and that is the best move, and actually just gives black enough counterplay in the position. So another nice pin. I suspect that Fischer played this and thought that this was perhaps fatal. But it's still not so clear. If bishop, I mean, this is obviously the threat, and if the bishop comes to d5, then knight g4 gives just enough counterplay. After this, that can't be taken, of course, because there's a bishop f7 check. And black actually holds his own. That threat to h2 is very annoying. So Fischer took on e5. Now this is an incredibly brave move. This had to be calculated so carefully. So this basically transposes or simplifies down into a position with rook against two bishops. But for the moment, black has regained some central control. You can see the major pieces dominate here, and white's forces have been, scattered a bit. Queen takes c3 is very interesting here, but Larsen went for queen e3 check. And here, if the king goes to the corner, which is really where we'd like it, then obviously there's a back rank checkmate. So Fischer's king had to step into the middle. So this is really perilous. And I mean, the calculation involved in making sure that white is okay in this position is incredible. I just think, it shows Fischer's ambition here and bravery too. Well, I mentioned that white's pieces are rather, scattered here, but in fact, let me show you one variation which shows their incredible potential. So in the game, Larsen played rook d2. But let me show you what happens on rook e6, which, well, a plausible move seeking to shield black's king. But watch this, queen c7, great move. So rook d2, threatening a mate. The queen comes back, defending this, checking the king. And now bishop c1 is a brilliant move. Incredibly, the king is safe. Those bishops and the queen do a remarkable job of protecting the king. Now watch this. There's some extraordinary stuff going on here. And magically, the game turns around in white's favour here. And suddenly it's black's king that comes under fire. And in fact, it's now well, it's basically a mating attack. Let me just take you through this. It's like just in the nick of time, white's pieces flood in at the other end of the board, and that's checkmate. So it shows you the potential of when major pieces work with bishops. In any case, rook d2 was played, threatening a mate. I mean, this looks terrifying, and Fischer would have had to have foreseen what was going on here a long time ago. So now mate threatened, queen threatened, but there is a way out, and that's bishop c5, only move. Attacking the queen, and it's an X-ray defense of f2. If the queen goes back, then, well, incredibly, this starts to look very good for white. For example, here, take on c4, and white is coordinating. So, in the game, bishop c5 just played. Rook f2 check. King steps here. Looks really frightening, but in fact, this is the best that black has. So, a check. King goes back, and black wins the queen, but has had to give up a lot of material. So we've got rook and two bishops against the queen. With all these pieces floating around, it's not absolutely clear that this is good for white. If something goes wrong, well, it could go wrong very easily with these loose pieces. In fact, Fischer has appreciated he's still doing well here. That takes a pawn and a check. Now here Larsen played king f6. Incredibly, king h5 is a good move, and the king is actually safer at the side of the board here, partly shielded by the pawns. Well, my computer thinks that black has enough to draw this position. It's still a complete mess, but it's interesting. But king f6 played. And again, my machine thinks that king e6 is still okay for black here, although I have to say this one is looking on the edge. But g5 played, which looks like a very natural move, but now things turn in white's favour. Fischer manages to coordinate. There are, often threats here and sometimes on this diagonal as well to the king. And we can see that, this is very important, of course, to be able to lock the pieces together so they're protected. This bishop protects the king on this diagonal. So white's king is relatively safe. So that prevents the a-pawn moving for the moment, but that check allows the pawn to advance, and then it'll be locked in by this bishop. Now, for example, what happens... Well, Larsen played queen c5 here, but what happens if the pawn is pushed? Well, in fact, white is in time here. And after the queen, you can take that and play the bishop back to g1, and white is safe on these diagonals and nothing to stop the pawn queening on the next turn. So basically, black is lost here. Now we need to get that pawn going, so rook b1 wants to bring the bishop to b6, and that was the final move of the game. Larsen resigned here. So this is all about just preparing the pawn's advance. So if c2, then we've got a check. The queen steps in the way. And now bishop e3. Stops that pawn advancing and prepares the coronation at the other end of the board. Wow. I mean, what an extraordinary game. Let me just put the... Yeah, that's the final position. A brilliant game by both players. so complex. But in the end, I think, Fischer, obviously fully deserved to win that game, because in a game of such complexity, he didn't make any blunders at all, which is extraordinary. It really is. Now, I've pointed out a moment where he could have improved his play with this move, bishop d6. But, even afterwards, no annotator spotted this move. And he was never worse in this game at all. So that was the first game over. I'll let you know soon what happened in game 2. Remember, if you want to see more of these videos in the series, then do check out the links in the video description below and in the info tab. And if you're not a subscriber, do click on that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.